Most people do not lose control in the middle of the day. They lose it in the first few minutes after waking, when nothing has happened yet, but the mind is already moving as if something has. Before the body even rises, thought has already left the room. It has gone back into yesterday, reopened unfinished emotions, stepped into problems that are still imaginary, and turned a quiet morning into a place of invisible pressure. This is why the morning matters more than most people realize. Not because it makes you more productive, but because it reveals whether your mind belongs to you before the world starts pulling on it. A calm morning is not a luxury. It is one of the first serious signs that you are no longer willing to hand your inner state over to momentum. The first mistake many people make is that they treat morning chaos as normal. They wake up into noise and call it responsibility. They wake up into inner pressure and call it adulthood. They wake up already restless, already mentally crowded, already carrying a weight the day has not even asked them to carry. And because this has happened so often, they stop questioning it. But that is exactly where the loss begins. If the first thing that greets you every morning is a storm of thoughts, then your day is not really beginning in reality. It is beginning inside unexamined mental weather. And that matters, because a mind that starts the day in turbulence will interpret everything through that turbulence. A small delay will feel heavier. A simple message will feel sharper. A normal demand will feel like proof that life is already too much. This is why the first battle of the morning is not with time. It is with inner momentum. The mind wants to continue whatever it was doing yesterday. If it was worrying, it keeps worrying. If it was replaying, it keeps replaying. If it was bracing for pressure, it wakes up already leaning into pressure again. Most people never interrupt this process. They just enter it. They do not notice the storm. They become the storm. And once that happens, even ordinary life feels like an attack. That is why one of the most important morning disciplines is not physical at first. It is perceptual. You have to notice that the noise has started before you start obeying it. You have to see the mind rushing before you call that rush necessary. Because the moment you can observe the storm without stepping into it completely, something changes. There is already more space in you, already more authority, already a small return of command, and from there, another problem becomes visible. The storm is not only noisy, it is fast. The mind does not just speak in the morning. It rushes. It creates the feeling that you are already late, already behind, already failing to keep up with a day that has barely begun. This is one of the strangest forms of self-inflicted pressure. Nothing dramatic has happened, no crisis has appeared, and yet inwardly the body begins serving a kind of invisible command. Hurry, move faster, catch up, do not pause, do not breathe too slowly, do not let the morning be simple. Let it become urgent before reality has earned that urgency. You can see how deeply this shapes a person. The phone is reached for too quickly. The body moves through washing, dressing, preparing, with a subtle violence that no one else sees. Even the breath becomes obedient to the pace of thought. And what makes this so dangerous is that it often feels responsible. It feels efficient. It feels like seriousness. But much of the time, it is neither seriousness nor necessity. It is psychological acceleration. The mind creates pressure first, and then the person arranges their behavior around it as if it were truth. This is why so many mornings feel exhausting before the day has even properly begun. The body is being asked to obey a speed that reality has not actually demanded. That is why slowing down in the morning is not weakness, it is correction. A slower breath is not a small thing when the whole mind is trying to drag you forward. A deliberate pause before reaching for stimulation is not trivial when the nervous system has already started rehearsing urgency, and a calmer pace in the first few minutes of the day is not laziness. It is a refusal to let imagined pressure become the emotional atmosphere of your life. Calm does not begin when life gets lighter. It begins when you stop matching the speed of every thought. It begins when you realize that the feeling of being behind is not always a fact. Very often, it is only a sensation produced by a mind that has forgotten how to begin gently. That gentle beginning is not soft in the weak sense. It is disciplined. It takes discipline to move slowly when your impulses want speed. It takes discipline to leave the phone alone for a moment when your mind is already hungry for noise. It takes discipline to let your first minutes belong to awareness instead of habit. But this is the kind of discipline that changes more than a schedule. It changes the tone in which you live. Because once you stop allowing the day to begin inside a storm, and once you stop obeying that inner rush as if it were law, you do not just gain a calmer morning, you begin reclaiming a calmer mind, and that is where real control starts. There is another mistake people make once they begin noticing the violence of the morning. They assume the answer is purely mental. They think that if they can just tell themselves to calm down, the storm will listen. But the mind rarely settles because it has been given a lecture. It settles when something in your way of moving stops feeding the disorder. This is why deliberate movement matters so much. Because the body is not separate from the atmosphere of the mind. It either deepens the rush or begins to interrupt it. You can feel this in the first few actions of the day, the way someone throws themselves out of bed, the way they cross the room with inward pressure already running through them, the way they wash, dress, prepare, and reach for stimulation as if every movement is being supervised by a voice that keeps whispering, faster, faster, faster. Nothing looks dramatic from the outside, but inwardly there is already force, already fragmentation, already that sense that the day is not being entered, but attacked. This is why small physical actions are more important than they appear, not because there is magic in ordinary tasks, but because ordinary tasks reveal whether your attention is with you or not. The hand on the sink, the pace of your steps, the moment you open the curtains, the way you prepare coffee or tea, the way you sit down instead of collapsing into the next demand. These things are usually treated as trivial because they are common. But they are not trivial at all. They are the first visible form your mind takes each day. And if those first movements are rushed, scattered, unconscious, they quietly teach the rest of the day to follow the same rhythm. Most people keep looking for control in grand gestures, when control often begins in a room that is still quiet, in how you stand, in whether your first breath is shallow and hurried or full and intentional, in whether you move like someone who has already surrendered to pressure or like someone who has decided that the day will not begin with internal chaos. That decision is not abstract. It has to enter the body. Otherwise, calm remains just another idea that gets admired but never embodied. There is a reason deliberate movement can restore order faster than excessive thinking. Thought alone can keep multiplying itself. One anxious thought becomes 3. 3 become 10. But the body can sometimes call the mind back with more honesty than the mind can call itself back with words. A slower walk to the kitchen, a quiet moment while washing your face, a deliberate breath before looking at a screen. These are not decorative rituals. They are interruptions. They break the alliance between inner turbulence and outer behavior. They tell the nervous system that not every morning has to begin in obedience to stress. And this matters because once the body joins the rush becomes harder to question. When your breathing is fast, your movements are abrupt, and your attention is already scattered across 10 directions, the mind begins to treat that condition as reality itself. You no longer feel like you are choosing a pace. You feel like the pace is choosing you. That is where people lose something important. They lose the sense that they are allowed to begin simply, allowed to begin cleanly, allowed to enter the day without first proving their seriousness through internal pressure. But there is discipline in deliberate movement, real discipline, not the dramatic kind people like to display, but the quiet kind that changes a life from underneath. It takes discipline to make your first actions conscious when habit wants speed. It takes discipline to move without that small hidden violence that so many people mistake for efficiency. And it takes discipline to understand that the morning does not need performance, it needs order. Once you feel that, ordinary acts begin to change their meaning. Standing up becomes a reset. Walking becomes a way of gathering yourself. Preparing breakfast becomes a way of returning the mind to one place instead of 10. The morning stops being a blur of tasks and starts becoming training in rhythm. That is where Stoic practice becomes something real instead of something admired from a distance, not in extreme moments first, but in whether your simplest actions come from self-command or from inner compulsion. The person who can move deliberately before the world begins demanding anything has already won a small but serious victory, because they are no longer letting the first energy of the day be borrowed from confusion. They are generating a different tone, a different tempo, a different self. And once that order starts returning through movement, another ability becomes possible. You begin to notice thoughts without being dragged by them. This is one of the most important shifts a person can make in the morning, because most people do not only wake into movement, they wake into obedience. A thought appears, and they follow it. A fear appears, and they grant it authority. A memory appears, and they let it set the emotional tone. There is almost no distance between mental activity and personal submission. That is why the mind can feel so tyrannical in the early hours. Thoughts arrive with force. They do not knock gently. They enter as if they matter, as if they are facts, as if they require action now, a concern about something happening later in the day, a replay of something awkward from yesterday, a criticism of yourself before your feet have even touched the floor. These thoughts often arrive carrying the emotional weight of commands. And most people have lived this way for so long that they no longer recognize what is happening. They think they are thinking, but often they are only being pulled. The critical difference is this: a thought can be present without being important. It can be loud without being true. It can feel urgent without deserving obedience. That distinction changes everything, because the real skill is not making the mind silent. Most people fail there because they choose the wrong battle. The goal is not to eliminate thought. The goal is to stop kneeling every time thought speaks. The moment you realize that an impression is not an instruction, you begin recovering authority over your own attention. This is where observation becomes freedom. Not passive observation, not vague mindfulness used as decoration, real observation. The kind that notices the thought forming, feels its pull, and still refuses immediate compliance. You wake up, and the mind says, "You are already behind." And instead of fusing with it, you see it. You notice the sentence. You notice the sensation it creates in the body. You notice the pressure it tries to produce. And in that moment, something opens. You are no longer completely inside the thought. You are standing near it. That space may be small, but it is enough. enough to prevent the first lie of the day from becoming the atmosphere of the day. Most unnecessary suffering begins because there is no such space. The thought appears and instantly becomes identity, mood, and behavior. A worry becomes a morning. A memory becomes a posture. A passing feeling becomes a lens through which everything else is interpreted. This is why observation matters so much. It protects your life from being shaped by first impressions that were never worthy of that power. It allows you to wait before granting authority, to question before surrendering energy, to remain present long enough to see that many of the mind's first offerings are only noise dressed as significance. And that quiet refusal to obey every impulse is not coldness, it is maturity. It is the beginning of an interior life that is no longer ruled by whatever enters first. A person who can observe the movement of thought without instantly becoming its servant develops a different kind of strength, less theatrical, more durable. They stop being pushed around by every mental weather change. They stop turning every inner fluctuation into a command to act, react, reach, fix, explain, or panic. They become harder to disturb because they are no longer so easy to recruit from the inside. That is what makes the morning such an important place to practice this. Early hours expose the mind before the world gets blamed for everything. They show you what kind of authority your thoughts have over you when life is still quiet. And if you can begin changing that relationship there, you start changing something much deeper than a routine. You begin changing the terms on which your inner life operates. Another reason the morning becomes heavy so quickly is that the mind does not only produce thoughts, it produces signals, small inner alarms. A notification lights up and the body tightens before you have even read it. A memory appears and something in you moves as if it has to be resolved immediately. A worry enters, and within seconds it is no longer just a thought in the mind. It becomes a change in posture, a change in breathing, a change in mood, a subtle command to act. This is how many people live now. Not from decision, but from interruption. Not from clarity, but from constant recruitment by whatever enters first. That is why one of the most damaging habits of modern life is the habit of treating every impulse like an emergency. The phone buzzes and attention runs toward it as if something important must be waiting. A concern enters the mind, and it is given authority before it has earned examination. A self-critical thought arrives, and the whole emotional atmosphere starts changing around it. A passing desire to check, fix, reply, scroll, explain, prepare, or anticipate begins to feel urgent simply because it was felt strongly. This is the trap. Force is mistaken for truth. Immediacy is mistaken for importance. The mind raises its voice, and the person obeys. But very little of what enters the mind in the morning deserves that level of obedience. That is the truth most people do not want to face, because it exposes how much of their life is spent in unnecessary reaction. Most mental intrusions are not commands, they are movements, they are offers, they are possibilities. Some deserve attention, yes, many do not. Yet if you have trained yourself to rush toward every stimulus, then you lose the ability to tell the difference. Everything begins to feel equally important. The unread message, the half-formed worry, the memory of something awkward, the urge to check one more thing before you even fully wake up. And when everything feels important, your attention is gone before the day has actually begun. This is why a quieter mind is not a mind with fewer impressions. It is a mind that has stopped promoting every impression into action. That is a different kind of discipline. A higher one, actually, because it is easier to obey than to discern. easier to reach than to pause, easier to respond than to question whether a response is needed at all. Most people think self-mastery is about making themselves do difficult things. Often it begins one layer earlier than that. It begins by refusing to let passing impulses dictate the terms of your behavior. You can feel this in something as small as not reaching for your phone the instant a thought tells you to. The movement may look trivial from the outside, but inwardly something much bigger is happening. You are interrupting a chain: sensation, impulse, action. You are breaking the automatic bond between mental urgency and physical obedience. And that break matters because the longer a person lives without it, the more they begin to feel that they have no real interior freedom. They start to believe they are simply like this, easily distracted, easily activated, easily thrown off course. But much of that is not identity, it is practice. It is repeated obedience to what never should have had that much power in the first place. A quieter morning, then, is built by creating distinctions. What deserves attention now, and what can wait? What is real, and what is only mentally loud? What calls for action, and what only asks to be noticed and released? This is where peace becomes practical, not in abstract ideas about serenity, but in your ability to stop turning every inward disturbance into outward movement. Because once every impulse becomes behavior, your life stops feeling chosen. It starts feeling managed by whatever arrives first. And the danger is not only distraction, it is exhaustion. When every impulse becomes a tiny command, your nervous system never really settles. It spends the morning preparing, checking, reacting, anticipating, correcting, bracing. Even before any meaningful challenge appears, you are already depleted, already inwardly scattered, already carrying the fatigue of a mind that cannot let anything simply pass through without becoming involved. This is why some people feel tired so early in the day, not because life has asked so much of them yet, but because they have responded to too many things that were never true demands. To stop treating every impulse like an emergency is not to become careless. It is to become selective. It is to say, not every signal deserves me. Not every thought deserves movement. Not every interruption deserves entry into my inner state. That selectivity is one of the foundations of peace. Because peace is not only what you feel when nothing disturbs you. Peace is what begins to appear when you stop granting full access to every disturbance that knocks. And once you begin living that way, another truth becomes impossible to ignore. The day is rarely shaped by events alone. It is shaped by what you do with them after they arrive. This is where people keep giving their power away without realizing it. They think the message ruined the morning, the delay ruined the morning, the tone of someone's voice ruined the morning. But most of the time, what actually ruined the morning was the speed and force of the reaction that followed. The event entered, then judgment entered, then emotion intensified, then the whole day took its color from that chain. A small inconvenience can remain small, but only if the mind knows how not to enlarge it. A message can be read without being turned into a mood. A delay can happen without being turned into personal offense. A mistake can be noticed without becoming self-attack. This is the part many people fail to see. They do not suffer only from what happens. They suffer from the interpretation added immediately after. And because this addition happens so quickly, it feels like part of reality itself. But it is not. It is mental participation. It is the mind stepping in too fast and giving extra weight to something that might have passed cleanly if left alone. This is why mastering your reactions in the morning matters so much. The early hours are usually made of small things: a sound, a message, a delay, a plan changing, the body feeling heavy, the mind feeling resistant. These are not dramatic events, but they are enough to expose the quality of your relationship with reaction. If every small disturbance is allowed to become emotional weather, then the whole day becomes fragile. It takes almost nothing to throw you off. And once that fragility is established in the morning, everything else begins landing on a weakened surface. The Stoic pause exists for this exact reason, not as a poetic idea, but as protection, a pause between event and judgment, a pause between irritation and expression, a pause between discomfort and interpretation. That pause may be only a few seconds, but it can save hours, because within it you recover choice. Without it, reaction moves faster than wisdom, and the day gets shaped by the most impulsive part of you. That is how a small frustration becomes a restless morning. That is how one inconvenient moment becomes a tone that keeps spreading into conversations, decisions, attention, and energy. The calmer your reactions, the clearer your decisions. That is not motivational language, it is mechanics. A reactive mind does not see cleanly. It exaggerates, personalizes, dramatizes, and acts too quickly. A steadier mind does not deny inconvenience. It simply refuses to hand inconvenience a larger role than it deserves. That refusal is a form of strength, not dramatic strength, not visible strength, but the kind that preserves your day from unnecessary distortion. And this is where real self-command begins to separate itself from mere self-image. Anyone can say they want peace. Anyone can say they value discipline. But what happens when the morning gives you something small and irritating? What happens when a message lands wrong, when your plans shift, when the mind starts telling a story within seconds? That is where character quietly appears, not in what you claim to believe, but in what you permit to shape you. The person who can remain measured in those moments is not emotionless. They are simply no longer so available to immediate distortion. This does not mean becoming cold or detached from life. It means becoming harder to hijack, harder to pull into emotional turbulence by every passing trigger, harder to recruit into tension just because tension knocked first. And that matters because once you stop treating impulses like emergencies, and once you stop letting reactions immediately define the tone of the morning, something important starts returning to you. Space. Space before action. Space before interpretation. Space before the mind turns every small event into proof that the day is against you. And once that space appears, you begin to notice something else. Much of the morning is shaped not only by what is happening now, but by what never really ended yesterday. A conversation that stayed open in the mind. A mistake that keeps replaying with unnecessary loyalty. A moment of frustration that should have passed, but was carried into sleep, and then carried back out of it again. This is one of the quiet ways people lose the day before it starts. They do not wake up only to the new morning. They wake up to emotional leftovers, and then they wonder why the day already feels heavy before anything new has even happened. The mind is strange in this way. It often treats repetition as usefulness. If it keeps replaying something, it begins to feel as if that replay must serve a purpose, as if returning to the same regret, the same unfinished exchange, the same irritation, somehow protects you from future pain or helps you finally understand it. But very often it does neither. It only extends the life of what should have ended. It takes what is already over and keeps it emotionally present. And that is costly, because every piece of yesterday that enters today without permission takes up room that the present actually needs. You can feel it the moment you wake up. There is no obvious disaster, no real crisis. But the mood is already tilted, not because the morning itself is wrong, but because something old has been allowed to arrive first. An unfinished conversation is still speaking in the background. A disappointment is still asking for another trial. A regret is still standing at the edge of attention, ready to shape the tone of the next few hours. This is why some mornings feel burdened even when the room is quiet. The burden is not in the room. It is in what the mind has chosen not to release. And this is where many people confuse attachment with responsibility. They think that holding on proves seriousness, that replaying proves reflection, that carrying emotional residue into a new day means they are being honest about life. But there is nothing noble about dragging dead weight into fresh time. There is no wisdom in making today pay for what yesterday failed to resolve. At a certain point, the mind is not learning anymore. It is looping. And a loop, no matter how sincere it feels, is still a prison if it never opens into action or peace. That is why letting go in the morning is not denial. It is discipline. It is the refusal to donate new energy to what is already finished. Not because the past did not matter. Not because you are pretending nothing happened, but because you understand that replay is not the same as repair. A mind that keeps reopening what it cannot now change is not being deep. It is being held hostage by its own inability to release authority. This is one of the hardest corrections a person can make, because the ego often feels important when it is still carrying something. But importance is not the same as usefulness, and suffering is not the same as depth. A clean morning often begins with a very simple act, not a dramatic ritual, not a speech, just an inward recognition. This is still here. This feeling, this memory, this unfinished irritation, this regret, this heaviness. And once you see it clearly, the next step matters even more. You do not climb inside it again. You do not start feeding it with fresh language and fresh emotion. You acknowledge it, and you set it down. Not perfectly, not forever, but deliberately enough that it does not get to become the emotional ruler of a new day. That act of release changes more than mood. It changes availability. When yesterday is not constantly speaking inside you, attention becomes cleaner. The present becomes easier to enter. Small things lose their exaggerated weight. You stop reacting to today through the distortion of what happened before. And that matters because many people are not actually responding to the morning in front of them. They are responding to a mix of memory, residue, anticipation, and unresolved self-judgment, which means they are not really here at all. They are negotiating with ghosts while pretending they are dealing with reality. And often, hidden underneath all of that, there is something even more corrosive than memory itself. There is the way you speak to yourself about what happened. Because many people do not only carry yesterday forward, they carry it forward as an accusation. Not just that went badly, but what is wrong with you? Not just that conversation was painful, but you always handle things badly. Not just you made a mistake, but this is who you are. That is where the morning begins to collapse inwardly, not only under the weight of what happened, but under the violence of interpretation that follows it. This is why self-criticism is such a destructive force early in the day. It destabilizes the mind before the outside world even gets a chance to touch it. You wake up, and before any real demand appears, you have already turned against yourself, already narrowed your own perception, already weakened your own composure, already created an inner climate in which everything feels harder because the one voice that should be helping you stand up is already attacking you from within. And the dangerous part is that this often disguises itself as discipline. People think harshness is honesty. They think self-attack means they still have standards. They think that if they are not hard on themselves, they will become soft, careless, indulgent. But most of the time, the opposite is true. A mind under constant internal assault does not become stronger. It becomes more fragile, more tense, more defensive, more easily thrown off course. Harshness does not create steadiness. It creates friction, and friction in the early hours spreads into everything, into your attention, into your decisions, into the way you read people's tone, into the way you handle inconvenience, into the way you inhabit your own body. A steadier morning begins when you stop assuming that cruelty toward yourself is a serious way to live. It is not. It is just a familiar one. Many people have repeated that voice for so long that they mistake it for intelligence. But intelligence does not sound like inner sabotage. Clarity does not begin by humiliating the self. A stronger mind is not one that wakes up and immediately starts prosecuting its own existence. A stronger mind is one that can see imperfection without turning it into identity. One that can recognize a flaw, a delay, a failure, a weakness, without using it as an excuse to become an enemy to itself. This is where inward patience becomes a form of power, not sentimental softness, not emotional indulgence, stabilization, because when the inner voice changes, even slightly, the whole nervous system begins to function differently. The morning no longer feels like a trial you have already failed before it starts. It begins to feel inhabitable again. You can think more cleanly. You can move with less invisible resistance. You can meet the day without the extra burden of defending yourself from yourself. And that is what many people have never really practiced. They know how to demand from themselves. They know how to criticize, compare, rush, and tighten. But they do not know how to begin the day in a way that keeps the mind structurally steady. They do not know how to create inner conditions in which wise action is actually possible, because wise action does not grow easily in a mind that is already under attack. It needs some degree of internal order, some degree of fairness, some degree of patience. Not because life is easy, but because without that stability, every ordinary challenge gets amplified by the fact that you were already divided against yourself before it arrived. There is a great difference between honest self-examination and habitual self-punishment. The first can refine you. The second only drains you. The first says, something here needs to change. The second says, something here is fundamentally wrong with you. One builds character, the other erodes it. And if you begin enough mornings under the rule of that second voice, eventually you will not only lose calm, you will lose trust in your own ability to meet life without inward collapse. So part of taking back control in the morning is learning to release two things at once: the residue of yesterday and the unnecessary aggression attached to it. To let the past stop speaking with so much authority. To let your mistakes stop becoming evidence for self-contempt. To let the first minutes of the day belong not to replay and accusation, but to a cleaner form of presence. One that can acknowledge, correct, and continue. Because a morning becomes livable when it is not crowded by old burdens and not poisoned by self-attack. That is when you begin to feel the difference between merely waking up and actually arriving. The day no longer begins as a continuation of emotional, unfinished business. It begins as a place you can enter with more room inside you, more steadiness, more fairness, more command. What many people never realize is that they do not only postpone rest, they postpone peace itself. They treat contentment as a reward that must be earned later, after enough progress, after enough control, after enough proof that the day is going well. So the morning begins with a silent condition placed on inner stability. I will settle once I answer enough messages. I will breathe once I catch up. I will feel okay once the day shows me that nothing is about to go wrong. Until then, the mind remains slightly contracted, slightly hungry, slightly unwilling to let go. And because of that, even a quiet morning can feel deprived before anything has actually been denied. This is one of the deepest habits of inner unrest, the belief that peace belongs to the future, that contentment is something to be granted after performance, after order, after visible progress. It sounds reasonable at first. It even sounds responsible. But it creates a terrible structure inside the mind. Because if you begin the day assuming that enoughness has not yet been reached, then every task, every interruption, every small imperfection enters a system that is already leaning toward dissatisfaction. Nothing arrives in a neutral space. It arrives in a mind that has already decided that this moment is incomplete. You can see this in very ordinary ways. A person wakes up and immediately feels behind, not only in time, but in worth. The room is quiet, but inwardly there is already pressure to improve the moment, justify the day, make progress quickly enough to deserve calm later. Even simple acts become tied to a hidden bargain. I must move efficiently enough to feel at ease. I must get enough done to allow myself peace. I must fix enough things before I'm allowed to inhabit my own life without tension. And so, contentment keeps being delayed, not because life has clearly denied it, but because the mind has made peace conditional on achievement. This is why the morning is such an important place to interrupt that pattern, because the first hour reveals whether you believe peace must be earned from the world, or whether it can begin as an inner posture before the world speaks at all. Stoic calm starts there, not in waiting for ideal conditions, but in refusing to make inner steadiness depend entirely on external sequence. The day has not gone well yet. The day has not gone badly yet either. It has barely started, and still the mind wants to decide that contentment must wait, that it would be foolish to rest too early, that sufficiency would make you soft, that peace now would somehow reduce your seriousness about what needs to be done. But this is one of the mind's quieter distortions. It assumes that tension is useful simply because it feels active. It assumes that inner strain is a sign of commitment. It assumes that if you stop pressing inwardly, you will lose your edge. Yet, most of the time, that pressure does not sharpen judgment. It clouds it. It does not deepen discipline. It corrodes it. It creates a person who is constantly leaning toward the next thing, unable to fully stand inside the present one. And when that becomes a lifestyle, even success does not satisfy for long, because the mind was never trained to experience sufficiency in real time. It only knows how to chase the next condition for relief. That is why practicing contentment in the morning is not sentimental. It is corrective. It is the decision to let the first minutes of the day be enough before they become impressive. To let a quiet breath be enough. To let a simple room be enough. To let the fact that you are here, awake, with another day in front of you, be enough to begin without immediate psychological hunger. This does not mean ambition disappears. It means ambition is no longer fueled by deficiency alone. You can still work, still build, still move toward what matters. But you are not beginning from the premise that life must first prove itself worthy of your calm. That shift matters more than people think, because when contentment is not postponed, the entire emotional logic of the morning changes. You stop treating every unfinished task as evidence that peace is premature. You stop turning ordinary incompleteness into a verdict against the present moment. You stop living as if a human morning must justify itself through output before it is allowed to feel whole. And once that happens, something inside you becomes less desperate, less available to the emotional blackmail of the day, less likely to panic when things remain unresolved for a while. Contentment, then, is not the end of discipline. It is one of its hidden supports. A mind that can recognize enoughness early in the day is harder to provoke into frantic striving, harder to manipulate through fear of falling behind, harder to drag into a constant state of internal negotiation. It becomes more selective, more measured, more able to work without inward starvation, and that is a very different life from the one most people are living, where peace is always pushed one task further away. Once you see that clearly, even the simplest parts of the morning begin to change their meaning. You stop seeing them as empty spaces between more important things. You stop treating them as inconvenient delays before the real day begins. And this is where another powerful shift happens. Ordinary acts stop being background and start becoming training. Most people think self-mastery belongs to dramatic moments, big temptations, serious confrontations, painful losses, important decisions. And yes, those moments reveal a lot. But character is usually not built there first. It's built in the unnoticed repetitions of ordinary life, in what you do when nothing impressive is happening, in how you stand in the kitchen when no one is watching, in how you breathe when there is no visible crisis. In whether your attention is with you while you wash your face, prepare breakfast, tie your shoes, open the window, or sit in silence for half a minute before touching the world. This is where Stoic practice becomes either real or decorative. If it exists only as a philosophy you admire in hard moments, it will remain mostly verbal. But if it enters your ordinary routines, then it begins to shape your nervous system, not just your ideas. A morning becomes training when the common acts inside it stop being treated as disposable. The first drink of water, the way you make the bed, the moment you sit down before checking anything, the decision to move without rushing. These things seem too small to matter until you realize that they are repeated every day, and repetition always becomes structure. What you repeat in a half-conscious way becomes the shape of your life. That is why ordinary morning acts carry more weight than their appearance suggests. They are not important because of what they are. They are important because of what they train. Attention, patience, rhythm, presence, restraint. If you cannot bring steadiness into the small acts that ask almost nothing of you, you will have a much harder time finding steadiness in the larger moments that ask a great deal. The person who cannot prepare for the day without inward fragmentation is usually not lacking wisdom in theory. They are lacking repetition in practice. Their ideals have not yet entered the body often enough to become natural under pressure. And there is something humbling in that. Most people want a stronger character, but they keep waiting for the moment that looks worthy of effort. They do not want to believe that how they walk to the bathroom, how they place the phone down, how they pour coffee, how they sit for a few quiet seconds could matter morally or psychologically. It feels too small, too ordinary, too unimportant, but that is exactly why it matters, because the self is not only revealed in major moments, it is rehearsed in minor ones. If every ordinary act is performed in distraction, hurry, and inward division, then the day slowly becomes a long continuation of that same fragmentation. But if ordinary acts become occasions to gather yourself, the opposite begins to happen. The morning teaches coherence, one movement at a time, one deliberate choice at a time. Not perfectly, not theatrically, just consistently enough that the mind stops feeling like a place where 10 different commands are always competing for control. This is also why repetition is more powerful than intensity. A person does not build calm by having one beautiful morning and then forgetting themselves for the next 10. Calm becomes real when ordinary acts have carried it often enough that the body begins to trust a different rhythm. When making tea is no longer only making tea. When stepping into the shower is no longer only another rushed task. When sitting in silence for a moment is no longer wasted time, but a quiet act of refusing to let the world rush in before you are ready to meet it. Then the morning stops being random. It becomes structured, and structure, repeated long enough, becomes character. That is one of the most important truths people miss. Character is not only what you do under public pressure, it is also what your smallest routines are teaching you in private. If your mornings repeatedly teach you haste, reactivity, distraction, and self-abandonment, those lessons will not stay in the morning. They will enter your work, your relationships, your decisions, your speech, your inner tone. But if your mornings repeatedly teach you patience, order, attention, and enoughness, those lessons will travel too. The day will begin carrying a different architecture, less inner crowding, less dependence on urgency, less need for everything to happen quickly in order for you to feel stable. So part of taking back control is learning to stop insulting the ordinary by calling it insignificant. The ordinary is where you are being trained all the time. The only question is in what direction, toward greater self-command or toward deeper habit, toward a mind that can stay with itself, or toward a mind that is constantly leaking attention into whatever shouts first. Morning routines are never just routines. They are repeated votes for the kind of inner life you are building. And once you begin treating contentment as available now, and ordinary acts as training rather than filler, something in the morning becomes much stronger without becoming harsher. You are no longer waiting for the world to organize you. You are no longer demanding that life become smooth before you allow yourself steadiness. You are beginning the day with a quieter authority, one built not on force, but on relationship. A better relationship to time, a better relationship to your own attention, a better relationship to the present before it turns into memory again. That steadier thing is awareness, and most people underestimate it because it looks too quiet to be powerful. They still believe control has to feel forceful. They think a better morning will come from pushing harder against the mind, from commanding themselves more aggressively, from trying to overpower distraction with intensity. But force is often the wrong instrument here. A mind that is already tense does not become clear because more pressure is applied to it. Very often it only becomes tighter, more divided, more exhausted by its own attempt to control itself. You can see this in the way people speak to themselves before the day has even started. Focus, stop thinking, get up, move, do not waste time, calm down, be better than this. And underneath all of it, there is strain. Not real order, not real steadiness. Strain. A person trying to dominate their own mind as if the self were a problem to be subdued, rather than something to be understood clearly enough to guide. This is why so many people mistake internal force for discipline when, in reality, it is often only another form of friction. They are not governing themselves. They are grinding against themselves. Awareness works differently. Awareness notices before it interferes. It sees the thought forming before the thought becomes behavior. It catches the impulse before the impulse recruits the hand, the breath, the mood, the pace of the body. It does not begin by shouting over the mind. It begins by seeing what the mind is doing with enough honesty that obedience is no longer automatic. That is a different order of strength altogether. Less dramatic, much more reliable. A person wakes up and immediately feels the urge to check, to move, to brace, to rush inwardly toward the day. Force says, do not feel that. Awareness says, there it is. Force says, suppress it. Awareness says, watch what it is trying to do to you. Force says, win the battle now. Awareness says, do not surrender your attention so quickly. That difference matters because what is seen clearly loses some of its power to control. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough. Enough for choice to re-enter. Enough for the day not to be handed over in the first 5 minutes. This is why awareness is so much more practical than people think. It is not vague, it is not decorative. It is not a spiritual extra for people who have time. It is one of the cleanest forms of control available to you. To notice the first anxious story before it becomes your emotional atmosphere. To notice the first impulse toward the phone before the screen begins shaping your nervous system. To notice the first tightening in the chest before the whole morning starts taking its orders from that contraction. These are not small things. They are the difference between being carried and walking, between being recruited by the mind and remaining in relationship with it. And this is why willpower alone fails so often. Willpower usually enters late. It arrives after the impulse has already started moving, after the body is already leaning, after the mood is already shifting, after the inner rush has already colored perception. Then it tries to reverse all of that through effort, and the person mistakes the resulting friction for seriousness. But awareness arrives earlier. It stands closer to the source. It notices the movement when it is still just movement. And when you can meet the morning there, at that earlier point, you need less violence to stay steady. The day no longer has to become a constant act of recovery from an inner collapse that happened before breakfast. This is also why awareness has a kind of humility that force does not. Force assumes the answer is always to impose. Awareness begins by learning. It asks, what happens to me in the first minutes of the day? Where do I go first? What thoughts tend to arrive? What sensations do I treat as commands? What habits begin moving before I have even become fully present? A person who can answer those questions honestly starts developing real self-command, because they are no longer trying to rule a mind they have not bothered to study. They are becoming intimate with the mechanics of their own inner life, and that intimacy, if it is honest, becomes guidance. Then, over time, something even more important starts becoming clear. A morning routine is never only a routine. It is rehearsal. It is daily instruction in how you are teaching yourself to meet life. If each morning trains you to wake into noise, obey false urgency, chase impulses, carry the past, attack yourself, postpone peace, and move without awareness, then that training will not stay confined to the first hour. It will travel. It will enter your conversations, your work, your reactions, your relationships, your sense of time, your identity. The way you begin the day gradually becomes the way you begin everything. This is why the morning shapes character so quietly that many people fail to respect it. They keep looking for character in major decisions alone, not seeing that major decisions are usually made by a person who's already been rehearsed by smaller habits for months or years. The way you respond to the first discomfort of the day matters. The way you carry yourself when nobody is watching matters. The way you handle one anxious thought, one inconvenient message, one moment of heaviness in the body, one urge to rush, one temptation to abandon yourself before anything has required it of you, all of it matters. Because character is not built only in what you survive. It is built in what you repeatedly permit. A calm morning, then, is not merely a pleasant preference. It is moral training in a quiet form. It teaches you whether you will live from reaction or from judgment, whether you will be ruled by whatever appears first, or whether you can remain long enough in yourself to choose what deserves authority, whether you will start from lack or from enoughness, whether you will inhabit your own life or arrive in it already scattered. These things do not sound dramatic, but they determine an enormous amount of what a person becomes over time. And that is the deeper reason the morning deserves respect, not because it can be made aesthetic, not because it can be turned into a rigid performance of self-optimization, but because it is one of the few places in life where character is still soft enough each day to be shaped again. The morning asks, quietly but seriously, who is entering this day? A mind already claimed by noise, a body already enlisted by pressure, a self already divided against itself, or someone who, even imperfectly, is learning how to begin from steadiness rather than surrender. That is why taking back control does not mean creating perfect mornings. It does not mean never waking up anxious, never feeling rushed, never carrying residue, never hearing the old inner voice again. It means something more realistic and more powerful than that. It means those things no longer get to arrive and rule without being seen. It means the storm may still appear, but it is no longer the unquestioned owner of the house. It means urgency may still knock, but it is not automatically invited in. It means the day can begin with imperfections present and still not be handed over to them. A calm morning does not guarantee an easy day. It guarantees something better than that. It means you are entering the day with more command over yourself than over circumstance. And that is the Stoic victory. Not controlling life, not forcing the world to become gentle, not arranging reality so perfectly that nothing disturbs you, but becoming harder to disturb because your inner life is no longer so easy to seize. When you stop letting the day begin inside a storm, when you slow the inner rush before it becomes your pace, when you use deliberate movement to restore order, when you observe thoughts without obeying them, when you stop treating every impulse like an emergency, when you master reactions before they spread through the whole morning, when you release yesterday, when you stop turning against yourself, when you practice contentment before the world starts demanding more, when you turn ordinary acts into training, when you choose awareness over force, something fundamental begins to change. The day does not become perfect. You become less available to chaos. And over time, that changes more than a morning. It changes the kind of person life keeps meeting. So tomorrow morning, before you ask anything from the day, ask something of yourself instead. Not perfection, not brilliance, not intensity, just presence. Just one clean moment in which you do not rush to abandon your own mind. One slower breath, one deliberate movement, one refusal to obey the first wave of inward noise. That is enough to begin. And beginnings matter, because the way you begin the day, again and again, becomes the way you begin your life.